Good morning and Afreich Chanukah. We're on page 1159, Aleph Kuf Nun Tes and Ayin Beis, volume 2. Okay, as promised, I reviewed it again. And I did what I always tell you not to do. I did, which was I assumed some things which I shouldn't have assumed. That when you learn the pshat, it's quite clear actually. And I overthanked it. I overthink the topic. So let's sum up what we learned yesterday, and you'll see what I'm going to present it the way I think is the simple pshat here. I also found earlier where this whole discussion about Malchus Nivdal, Kayach Nivdal is, which I'll refer to shortly. It's the beginning of volume 2, actually. There may be more places, but the one that is most explicit is back on page, just looking what page it is, Chassidus and Primis Malchus, which is back very early on, somewhere in the area of 670 or 663, 64. Yeah, and on. So that also helps. So here's the story. The Rebbe Rashab is now very clearly bringing together the whole discussion about the interface of the Ayin be'emtza. Remember, we're calling the Ayin the channel, that field of energy of Oyer, which sits in between, so to speak, serves as an interface between Yesh Amiti and Yesh Hanivra. So that Ayin divides into two. One that represents godliness, the source, and one that presents the producer, and one that presents the product of the producer, meaning the creation. The first one we elaborated at length about, with all the different four different levels of that Ayin, total bittul. That's what its role is to serve as divine awareness and complete bittul to its source. So we learned the four different meanings, four different levels, I should say, and types of bittul. We also learned about the three different interpretations of that Ayin of the Yesh Hamiti. And then comes the Ayin of Yesh Hanivra. Now we're talking about the divine energy that was designated from the outset to serve creation, to serve the process of creating something. Because if you only have the first Ayin, existence would not be able to exist. Because that Ayin is all about bittul. We need a Yesh. So we need an Oyer, an Ayin that fits to the Yesh, that fits into the Kalim, and ultimately can become a divine energy that's concealed, and yet it sustains all of existence. So that Ayin cannot be the first level of Ayin in the logical process of things. So this Ayin of the Yesh Hanivra, we learned throughout Ayin Beis. It was just he didn't use the word Ayin, he used other words. If you remember the whole discussion, the difference between Aramimche Elekai HaMelech. Elekai HaMelech, he spoke about was Koyach. Elekai HaMelech, from the word Koyach, and Melech, Malchus. That's what he's referring to here. When he keeps saying Commotion is Bar Le'il. So back in the beginning, what I just mentioned, pages approximately 665 and on. So he talks about Malchus, Elekai HaMelech, because he wants to explain. If you remember the two interpretations that are Mimcha Lekai Melech, one is Mamayla Lamata, one is Mamata Lamayla. You're connecting the divine energy within existence to the divine energy beyond existence. Arimimcha goes on Keser. Elekai Melech goes on Koyach HaPoyel Benifel, how Malchus enters into existence and energizes, sustains, and creates, energizes, and sustains existence. And you want the connection, that's the interface. So now he's connecting the Ayin of the Yesh Hanivra, which now, that's why he's pushing it on Malchus. He's bringing Malchus in, because that's what was discussed much earlier, Elekai HaMelech, Arimimcha Elekai HaMelech. That seems the most obvious reason that he's bringing it in, besides connecting all the dots here. So in Malchus, we know there's two levels of Malchus. There's Malchus as it's in Atzilus, and there's Malchus as it enters into Biyah. So basically, Malchus of Atzilus becomes the Keser the crown of Biyah. That's how it is in all the worlds. So both levels are what he calls a koyach nivdel, ha'ara nivdelis. Why? Because it's not talking about the core essence of Asilus, which is chachma, bina, das. If you talk about a human being, the Malchus of the person, of the king, is the lowest faculty that he has, because it's not talking about his whole personality, as we discussed. Okay, so that's that. That's why it's called the ha'ara nivdelis, ha'ara of a ha'ara. In different words, Elokim. Havaya is the power to create, but it travels through Elokim. And that's okay. Then he brought the example that he said the main element in Malchus that is nivdal is these words, Va'ikar. Ikar masha shayach lemeshu b'chinas nivdal. I'm reading around halfway down the page on page 1159. The primary thing where you could say in Malchus that it's nivdal is the Isis and Kalim of Malchus. In other words, there's also the of Malchus. And there's Malchus as it receives the hashpah, the transmission from the higher spheres. Remember, Malchus is also compared to the moon. The moon, on one hand, doesn't have any light of its own. All its light is a reflection of the sun, which is Zah, the Midas. On the other hand, it's the moon that brings the light into the Kalim. So the moon has many different parts to it. We talked about there's the higher part, the lower part. So basically he's saying that the main primary place where you talk about nivdal is as it manifests in the Isis and Kalim. But he's going to say also the Oyer is also nivdal. So what's the Isis and the Kalim? He says those are the Asarim Amoris. Those are the letters and the words of the 10 statements that the Eibishter stated. Actually said Yehi Oyer, Yehi Rekiya, Vayemer Elokim, Vayemar. Or B'dvar Hashem Shamayim Nasu, B'dvar Hashem. So usually when you read it and without Chassidus, okay, it's an expression. But Chassidus makes it's called B'dvar Hashem. That means Dafke Dibur and Dafke Amira, speaking. Why? Because speaking is how the entity, using the muscle of a human being, if we did not speak to each other, a teacher can be brilliant, but if he doesn't have speech, he doesn't have a relationship with another. So speech is the first connection in real time with our communication with another. So dibur is an excellent way of explaining how a lakus is relating to existence. When the Eibishter speaks, the Asarim Amoris, he says that relates to existence. It's still a lakus, but that's what he calls the Asius and the Kalim of Malchus. For all practical purposes, Asius and Kalim are right now synonymous, even though he uses both expressions. So, because when you break it down, they're different levels, but basically Isis and Kalim are the carriers of the energy. So what energy are they carrying? They're carrying Havaya. They're carrying the energy of creation, but it's filtered and channeled through these letters. Okay, so that's B'chinas Nivdal. So that's B'chinas Nivdal. Then he said, and let me just a second. I'm just using some of the lines we learned. That, for example, like speech, that they leave, they exit, they carry outward, and they separate from the person who's speaking, bizgalus, as he reveals himself to another. So that's dibur. So in other words, you would say so that's dibur. What about before the dibur, before you actually speak? How are those, like he says, how are those, that expression that you're going to use in your words when it's still inside your heart or in your intelligence, in your mind? So he says, they're not as nifrid as when you actually speak. They're miyuchet, because they're still part of you. You haven't yet expressed it to another. But then he qualifies, he says, nevertheless, it's also not a yichud mamish. So we have a level that's not nifrid, but not yichud mamish either. So it's miyuchet, but not a yichud mamish. Why? As I explained yesterday, because at the end of the day, it's still if you're feeling emotions to someone else, or you want to explain an idea to someone. So you haven't technically done it in speech, but it's still beginning to relate to the other. So in that context, think of it like dibur shebemachshava. He doesn't use that term here, but we used that term earlier. That it's still part of who you are, but it's already preparing to communicate to another. So there's basically two levels. The way it's still in your heart, in your mind or your heart, that's how dibur, Malchus, is still within Zah, the Malchus within Zah, or the Kalim of Zah. Those are the two ways he explains how it's still within you, but it's not completely one with you. Why? Because it's already a component that is going to be relating to another. So it doesn't have the same yichud, for example, that moichin may have, or even higher levels of a person's faculties that go all the way back to the etzem hanefesh, meaning to the very core of the human being. So it's the first step. So in other words, if your emotions are stimulated toward another, what he calls chemdes libe, or not just to another, it could be to anything. You have some desire or passion in your heart. That's step one. So that he calls, it's miyuchad, but not yichud mamish. Then comes step two, where you actually express it in dibur. That's Malchus. Malchus as a separate parsuf. There, Malchus is what he calls nifrit. Okay, now, he says not only the Isis and the Kalim are this way, also the Oyer. And he gives an example, because the seichel that you communicate, your speech, is not words only. It's not just the words that are separate from you. Also, the idea that you're imparting is somewhat separating from you. When I say separate, it means it's relating to another. Okay, so that sums up that. So 1 second here, come here, seichel, yeah. And this is the meaning that the Oyer and Keli, now he's saying not just the Oisius and the Keli, but the Oyer as well, because what you're doing is you're taking intelligence or emotions and you're expressing them to another. That's called nifrit, meaning it's not just about you and how it relates to yourself, it's already going outward. With the Eibishter, it's very clear. It's how Milad Dehadyeta, we said. This is how God is creating existence. We know as a creator, the artist or the creator is not defined by existence. In other words, the dibur that he said, B'dvar Hashem Shemayim Nasu, the Asarim Amoris, is an expression of God's, but it's an expression as it relates, so to speak, to an entity that's not godliness in its purest form. It's an entity that's the creation. So therefore, dibur works very well as an example of nivla. And it's not just the keli and the oisius that he's saying, it's also the energy that's manifest in them is now packaged and tailored toward expression to something outside of the core of the entity. Like he said, B'Shem Melikim, the words were, or Shem Apula, sorry, Lifil Dovashu Chutz Le'etzem. He used that expression, top, the fifth line on the top of the page. To affect something that's Chutz Le'etzem. Now, as I explained, there's nothing Chutz Le'etzem really, but in our existence, due to the Tzimtzum, the student feels himself apart from the teacher. So there's the Oyer. If you would speak about the Ayin of the Yesh Amiti, you'd be talking about the Oyer as it is within the teacher. It's all about the source. But when you're talking about the Oyer that's relating to the student, that's my language here. Or in this case, speech. That is already now relating to another, and that's a second level of an Ayin of an Oyer Eliki. So the issue I had yesterday is really non-issue. I thought that he was talking about three levels, because he talked about Malchus and Biyah, Malchus and Atzilus, and Malchus that is encompassed in Zah. So though that's true, what he said earlier, but the fact is when it comes to Dibur, he was only talking two levels. The speech itself and how the emotion is still in Zah, which he calls either Malchus, the exact words are, either it's, so he says, just to read that parenthesis again, he says, that's what threw me, because when he said Gam Kameshu Atzilus, I thought, okay, so till now he's speaking to Malchus and Biyah, which I thought was the Dibur. But really he's not saying that. He's saying also the way the Dibur is in Atzilus. It's a separate faculty, so-called drawing something outside of the core essence. Canal, like he said in the previous parentheses, The gamma asis haklulim b'chemtes alev, the letters, which means the letters of dibur that are going to express your passion from the heart. As they are klulim in chemtes alev, they're not b'chinas yichud mamish. They're not. He called them yuchodim, but not yichud mamish, because they're already a form of expression. But it's still within yourself. It's like the expression to another, but not yet reached to other. It's still how you formulating it. So he says, Shezeu dimyan. What's the dimyan of this level as the asis are kolol in the lev? He says that's an example of b'chinas hakelim dezod atzilus. Either that's referring to the kelim of zav atzilus, the midas, the kelim of the midas are the oisius, as they are still within you of the passion of your heart. Or, which of course fits more here, or it's Malchus, which means like dibur, the way it's still encompassed in the heart, in the passion and desire of the heart, and has not yet formulated into actual words. So we have one level is how Malchus or is encompassed in Zah. That would be how you have the heart feelings, the feelings of passion are there, but have not been expressed. And then when does it become expressed and becomes a koyach nivdol mamish? Not just not yichud gamur, or not yichud mamish, avul kameshu b'chinas partzu b'fnei atzmei, which means when Malchus becomes a partzu b'fnei atzmei, not as it's encompassed in Zah, in Midas, harizeh b'chinas nivdol, when it becomes a structure of its own. And he doesn't distinguish here between Malchus and Atzilus and Malchus and Biyah. So everything is clear. It's basically two levels. Now, when you really break it down, obviously there's Malchus then goes into Biyah, like he said earlier. But bottom line, what's relevant to us is that Malchus, even in Atzilus, is a koyach nivdal. In contrast, and even as it's in its source in the Midas, it's also not yichud mamish, but the real nivdal, the real separate is when God, in other words, when God thought the Asar Mamoris, and he wanted existence, but he didn't say yet the words, Yehi Ayir, Yehi Rakia, that would be the level of not yichud mamish, it's encompassed within him, but it's not yet articulated. When he said Yehi Ayir, and obviously we're not talking in time, we're talking in conceptual levels, that's when it becomes a patzer b'fnei atzmei. So it's not speech within your thought, it's actual words. Those words are koyach nivdal, but it's not just the koyach nivdal, it's also the oir in the words. In other words, the energy, the content, the spirit, the message conveyed through these words is also apart from you, meaning it's not completely only you now, it's also relating to another outside of yourself. The only distinction is by the Eibishter, nothing's outside of him. By us, and human beings, the muscle obviously is an actual you and I are two different people. With the Eibishter, it's all within, obviously everything, as I said, encompassed, but lefiyerech, in God, in the godly energy, divine energy itself, there are levels. Okay. That's what we reach to. Now, and as I said, I referred you back to Tafres, let me see exactly. Well, the whole subject matter really is explained earlier there in the Koyach and Peil level. He talks about Koyach and Peil a lot there. If you look at page 664 in Ayin Beis, volume 2, he starts with Bir Ayin Nisavis Yeshman B'chinas Malchus. If you look there, if you see, he says B'chinas Ayin Hamokar Liyesh. So Who B'chinas Havdalah. Check it out right now. If you look there, you'll see that that's when he starts discussing how Malchus is that. He actually calls it the Ayin of the Mokar Hayesh. So it's the Ayin of the Yesh Hanivra. It's explicit there. Yeah. Yeah, it's at length there. Whatever we learned here is there at length. Much more than okay, yeah, clear. Alakai Lashon Kayach. Yeah, Kayach. Malchus Kayach. And there I see he's speaking the same ideas because he asked there the question, at the end of the day, the koyach is still connected to God. So how could you call it nivdal? If you look on page, it's the whole thing about dveikus. If you look on chapter 331, bottom of page 680, he asked the question that koyach is also dovek b'mkeireh. So how could you call it nivdal? Yeah. So some of what he said there, we're going to learn now in the next section. But it clearly goes hand in hand with what's discussed there. Yeah, it's very clear. It's interesting how many pages we're talking now 680 and we're at 1159. So we're talking here 200, how many pages? 680? 500 pages.
6-7 years ago.
No, probably 3 years ago, 4 years ago. Okay, but yeah. Okay, so we're going to learn now is very much connected to the pages that I just referred to, 680 and on. So let's continue. And now he's going to say the same question. It says, Vagam, okay. Vagam the kol keich eliki. You're just telling me now that the ayin of the Yesh HaNivra is connected to ha'ara v'ha'ara. And it's a keich nivdal like Malchus, meaning it's somewhat separate from the core. But so he qualifies this now. Vagam, and though Vagam the kol keich eliki, and though every divine faculty, gam afilu b'madrega yeset tachtena, even the lowest of the faculties, even the power of action, God's ability to just act, create. How do you b'chinas dveikus? You're telling me it's not b'chinas dveikus, it's a nivdal, everything, it's a koyach eliki. Or to put it in different words, dibur, even when you speak and someone else hears it, you can't say the koyach hadibur is nivdal. You could say it's relating to something outside of you. But the koyach itself is part of who you are. So even your lowest faculty, even the movement of your toe, koyach hatanua, we learned earlier, the power of movement is from the lowest faculties. It doesn't require the effort, let's say the exertion of the mind, or the intensity of the midas, the motions. But it's still a koyach. So he's saying every koyach eliki, even the lowest one, is still davuk, it's still b'chinas dveikus. The im leikein, because if you don't say that, eichu koyach eliki, how can you call it a divine power? We didn't say nifred and nivdal was in a way that it became out. It's no longer godliness. It's a godly faculty. It's only not chachma bina das. It's malchus. It's not the deepest faculties that the divine faculties is the most external one. Malchus as it relates to creation and speech and so on. But you can't say it's not a koyach eliki. You can't say it's not dveikus because then it would then echu koyach eliki. Ubafrat, this would be true about any faculty, any divine faculty, and specifically be'inyan ha'isavus. We're talking here about creation. We're not just talking God's faculty that God, for example, sends bread to earth. He sustains us by giving hazana sakel. He's talking about creation itself, and creation is only capable. The only one capable to create is Atzmus. Shesorechli is dafka that dveikus b'mkeireh. Well, let me restate that. It's kamatzmus, but he says there, it's only possible through being attached and connected to its source. Like he says in Nageres Akedah Simon Chav, that's where he says that in order to create yesh ma'ayin ve'efes hamuchlat, a yesh that does not feel that it has a cause or a ein le'ila v'siba, has to come from the koyach atzmus, ein le'ila v'siba, and through Ayin, which is dveikus, because existence needs to be constantly connected to the pipeline of its sustenance. So we're not just talking about hashpah, which also is a koyach eliki and has to be connected to the divine source. Especially koyach esbin yasavis needs to be dveiked, like he says in Ageres Akedesh 20. So he's now going to explain. So how do we explain? How do we reconcile these two factors? It's a part of divine energy, divine faculties, and yet you're calling it like nivdal. So he says like this: Hine. This is the response. Hine. And now, inyan hatveikus the kol keichel akim avor b'makam acher. Regarding this dveikus of the keichel akim. So, like I said, with speech, when I speak, even though the speech is reaching another, but the speech is connected to me. When God speaks, the same is true, and even more so, obviously. She says he explains elsewhere, and to me, it sounds like that elsewhere is what I just referred you to. Page 680, which is interesting because before he said commotion is bar ill. Now he says b'mokam acher. So now he's referring to, if you go to page 686, that's where he starts talking about this dveikus of the koyach eliki. Parallels what it says here. I'm going to go over it again inside earlier, but check it out. Seems to me, literally, he's summing up what he wrote earlier. So he says like this. So it's explained elsewhere regarding this dveikus, this connection, in other words, this attachment of the divine power. Remember, we're talking about the divine power to create. So on one hand, yes, it's not just talking about God regarding God, it's God relating to existence. Fine. But it's still, he said, attached. It's still connected. So here's what he says. So elsewhere it explains about this attachment, this connection of the koyach eliki that is invested in creation. He says like this. Mavur b'makam acher explains elsewhere shezeh b'bchinas ischachus, that this dveikus is not a dveikus due to the fact that this koyach is about expressing godliness. Rather, its focus is that it needs to always be connected like a pipe, like electricity has to be connected to its source, or else it would not, the existence would cease to be. So he says, that this dveikus is like saying that God, like he says in Shiur v'amunah, he needs to constantly renew his speech. He cannot, he can't stop speaking. That means the speech, even though it's relating to existence, needs to always be connected, attached to the speaker. So what dveikus means here is the constant, perpetual renewal of the energy. It's an interesting word. In other words, it's not dveikus because it's just bittul. It's dveikus because it needs. Because if for 1 second there's a cutoff, the energy stops and the existence stops to be. If you look back on page 686, he says that because dveikus mamish. By Ayin, it's dveikus mamish. Ayin is not about being renewed because it needs to be renewed. Ayin doesn't have anything of its own. All it is a reflection of Elikus. I'm reading back from page 686, chapter 334. It's not an extension. It's not like sunlight coming from the sun. It's a force that is, so to speak, God has created another track that's going to create existence, but it's in a state of ischachus, shemischadish from Kedei. So dveikus there is talking more about the capacity to have this renewable energy. So this is literally a word from there, or almost word for word. But let's continue here, and then we'll go back if need be. So he says, like we say, he renews every day, constantly creation. So that's a dveikus, because he has to renew it. So Chassidus explains when you say b'chol yom, it's just talking generally. It really means every second. She says this, that we're saying, that there needs to be the renewal, the perpetual renewal, every day and every moment. The rega, every moment and every second. You know, you could, why does it not just have one energy that flows once, that extends for a long period of time? Why does it constantly have to be renewed every second? The Eibishter could have created in a way, he invested energy in existence, and that's that. And that would be a nivdal, that would really be nivdal. So why do you need that why can't it be a nimshach chayis meshach al meshach zman? Like, you know, for example, you throw a stone, you don't need to keep holding the stone when it's flying. You invested enough energy that will last for a little while till it falls. Obviously, with God, he can do a lot more than that. So he says the reason is because the key here is that the chayis, the energy, the vitality, the energy force, needs to be attached b'mkede in its source. The oz dafka b'chinas er v'chayis. Only then is it real, true energy and vitality. If, one second, let me just, yeah. Because if it was only for a period of time, no, it was until the energy dissipates, then it would be like a stone taka. It would fly for a few minutes and then it would fall. That would not make it, even while it was flying, it's not a flying stone. It's just that you have put some energy into it. Since you want to have here a existence that is constantly filled with vitality and dynamic energy, so that requires it be connected all the time to its source. Like the example would be a soul and a body. The soul doesn't just put energy in the body and it takes off. It constantly needs to renew its energy all the time to keep a person alive in the fullest sense of what life is. Now, if our bodies were just like stones, and it's like a balloon that you just blew air into, then obviously you could blow air in a balloon, and as long as the balloon lasts, it lasts. But if you want the balloon, the fact that the keli itself, to be alive like we are, there you need the energy to be flowing all the time. Aval advekus, now he says. So this, but however, this dvekus, this attachment to its source, in other words, there's a constant flow of divine energy into existence. He says, this is only hurag b'derech ischatzus. It's only in a form of renewal, not because it's fundamentally attached, but it's because it's a renewal process, so it needs to renew from the source. Loi b'bchinas dvekus mamish. And I'll again, just to elaborate on the explanation. Oir's whole inyan is bittul. It doesn't have a separate entity or a separate identity, as we learned the 4 levels. That's Oir. A yesh is being created by the Ayin, the chayes alaki. So he's saying, he says, how could you call that koyach alaki nivdal? The Oir is not nivdal. But how could you call the koyach alaki? He says it's still nivdal. The only reason it's dveikus that you're calling it part of the divine energy is because it needs constantly renewal, not because it fundamentally feels it's connected. That's not its role to be connected. Here the chayes alaki in creation, its role is to create, to focus on creation. However, to create, and in a way that the vitality is constantly sustained and renewed from the source, you need to have dveikus. If you have no dveikus, things would just simply cease to be. So you see here, so dveikus can be for two different reasons. One is because you're fundamentally bottled to the source. Another is because you need energy. So even the chayes aliki of the ayin of the yesh anivra that manifests in a way that relates to existence is also remains connected, but not due to the fact that it feels connection, but rather connected because that's where the energy is coming from. Now, obviously, the ayin itself does feel the connection. You have to say that. But the yesh that's receiving it does not necessarily feel it, even though that's not what he says explicitly. But basically, he says, it's due to ischachus lebechinis dveikus mamish. So in other words, when God said, Basara Mamoris Nivra Elam, yes, it's a faculty of his Dvar Hashem. It's the words of God connected to the Medaber, the Eibishter. But the main connection is not because it's connected to the source and reflecting the source, because its function is not the source, is not reflecting the source, it's to create. But in order to create, it needs to be constantly attached and connected to its source. That's what he's calling Chachos versus Dveikus Mamish.
So it's two different things, even though that you're calling them both dveikus.
Well, yeah, as a matter of, no, he's calling one is not dveikus, he says mamish. It's a dveikus that's only due for the ischachus. In other words, basically, it's simply put this way. The ayin of the yesh amiti, or oir, in its full form, it has only one role, to reflect godliness. The oir that is there, koyach eliki, to create, has a function called creation. It can't just be absorbed completely, as I mentioned with the chief of staff. Let's just go back to the mashal. The chief of staff spends his day and time with the king. His job is only to convey the instructions and the orders of the king. The people working, following those instructions, whether it's department heads or people working in the fields or the military or other people in the government and the empire, they are also following the king's orders. But their function is not about dveikus to the king. Their function is getting the job done. So in that sense, it's nivdal. On the other hand, they are constantly aware of and constantly being sustained, especially when it comes to creation, from the king's energy. But that's very different. Their role, however, is not reflecting, like we've learned about the two levels of oir. There's oir, me'ein etzem, kamoya etzem, and mina etzem. So obviously, or oir eliki, all divine energy comes from God. But God wanted two types of energy. One that would reflect me, my vision, my kavanah, my intention, the ultimate bittul of ayin of the yesh amiti, and another energy to create. I want to have a creation. I want to adira b'tachtenim. You need tachtenim. For tachtenim, you need energy that goes eris and kalim in eisius, yihirakia, yihirakia, and so on, right? And that energy is focused on the creation. However, the fact that it's still part of the divine energy is only focused not because it's davuk be'etzem, that its whole role is to connect and attach to the source. That's not its role. Its role is to create the davar nifra, the davar nivdal. However, because it's creative process, that energy is constantly connected to its source. So basically, it's two different energies. One reflecting godliness, one function, one's creating what God wants, but that too is connected by a pipe, so to speak, a constant connection, what he calls his chachos. That's the difference between dveikus mamish and chachos. If you go back again to page, what I referred, page 688, Tafresh. Yeah. Especially Tafresh Pevov. 686. Very directly says it very, very explicitly. This is more of a kitzur, what he says there. Okay.
I know we mentioned that last time. The originating mitziyorim is completely different thing, or even about these oiris.
I'd rather not talk about anything he's not talking about here. To me, it just confuses me because I'm focusing on what the Rebbe is saying right now here, the Rebbe Rashab. Once we finish, we can go analyze. I would not go there. For me, maybe you have it all understood, so you can go there. But I just need to learn we have to learn what he's saying right here before we connect it to other subjects.
Thank you.
Okay. Now he continues. Shekenu gam b'keich eliki hamahave. I thought he was talking about the keich eliki hamahave. Okay, 1 second. So this that we just said, that the koyach halaki that creates the reason I'm pausing because I'm trying to understand. I thought he was talking about the koyach halaki. Okay, I guess it's just a matter of expression. He's concluding the sentence. So he says, so this dveikus that we're talking about regarding creation is hurak b'derech ischachus. In other words, its main purpose of dveikus is for the renewal of the energy, and not for dveikus mamish, for being connected as an end in itself. The connection is in order to renew. Shekenu gam b'keich eliki hamahave. That's what we're discussing here. The same thing is with God's power to create. Shazayin amachadish ma'aseh bereshis. Amachadish b'tuva b'chol yom, like he said. That this is in the form of machadish. So, okay, fine. So that last sentence belongs to the previous section. Now the Rebbe Rashab continues. Okay, he still wants to probe further. Because here we have like this interesting mix. The ayin of the yesh amiti, we understand, is complete dveikus. And in the 4 levels we learned. The ayin of the yesh anivri says it's only dveikus due to ischachus, for renewal. But it's not really fundamentally about the connection to the source. And remember, so now he's saying, why he's not asking, but he's qualifying. Why does the Isavas have to be dafka from the Ir HaDovuk B'Mkeirei? Now, I thought he answered that before by saying because he wanted to have vitality. If you want it to be alive all the time, and not just like a dead thing that's just being propped up by an external force, you need to constantly renew it. But let's see what he's going to say. So he says like this, and this is what the Hisavas needs to be from an Ir Dovuk B'Mkeirei, from an Ir that's attached to its source. Hini be'emes ha'Hisavasi m'bchinas ha'Ir shu Dovuk. Rak ha'Hisavas b'peil im ha'Ir she'b'slapshus b'bchinas Malchus. Okay. I see what's going on here. The Rebbe Rashab, I would guess, this would be an intelligent guess, I think, that this piece, the Rebbe Rashab added afterwards. I just feel it from the language because it's not, seems to be flowing the same flow. It looks like an add-on and not Chaz v'Shalom that's a problem. I mean to say that it's very bekitzer and he's relying that we learned earlier the ideas that back in page 600s. Because I see the way he's speaking is very, very dense. So we'll go a little slower here to make sure this is clear. Because now, what is he saying now? We just established, everything is clear. There's two tracks of energy. One is like the Ayin of the Yesh Amit, Ir Dovuk, Veikus Mamish of Oir. One is a Oir, a Koyach Eliki, that goes into it enters into creation, remains attached to the source to continue the flow of vitality and energy, mechadish betuve, cheschachus. So what's missing here? But he's saying, this is what he's adding now. The key word is oir. 1 second, let me explain. She says, the key here is that's me'oir hadovuk b'mkeirei. The second track is not independent from the first one. In other words, he's saying the koyach ha'yisavus, even the koyach halaki that we just explained, its function is creation, and its attachment is only due to renewal, he says it also comes from Eir HaDavar B'Mkeireh. We just said Eir is Davar B'Mkeireh. In other words, to put it in different words, the Ayin of the Yesh HaNivra is not an independent track. It's coming from the Ayin of the Yesh HaMiti. In other words, Hisavus, even the second track, is also connected to Dveikus, to the market, real Dveikus Mamish. It's only now manifesting in a way to speak, to create. This is what he's going to explain now. In other words, what's the connection? So the Atzmus is here, just an inyan. Kecha Atzmus, to create. Through the Ayin of the Yesh HaMiti carries the power of creation. And that's Oyer Dovuk, Dveikus Mamish. It comes to a level of Oyer and Chayis that goes Asarim Amoris, Malchus, that encloses itself, Lefi Hakelim, Lefi creation, according to the creation, Oyer Dibur. So we're saying the Dibur is relating to another, but it still remains attached in order for renewal. But he's saying, but it's not just the case. The Dibur is also connected all the way back to the Oyer HaDovuk. So here's how he explains it now. So he's going deeper into explaining the process of creation, that it's not just two tracks, the track of Ayin of Yesh HaMiti and the track of Ayin of Yesh HaNivra. Here's what he's going to say. Hine be'emes, in truth, ha'isavas hi me'bechinas ershu davuk. So in a way, he's like not backtracking, because before he said hisavus is not like oyer, that's veikus mamash. Oyer eliki, oyer, he says, yeah, right. And now he's saying that the truth is hisavus comes from the oyer that's davuk shu davuk. It's not just coming from a koyach; it's coming from the oyer that is attached. Rakai savas bepeil. That's the power of hisavus, the actualization of it, the execution, so to speak, the implementation of the actual creation. Bepeil. That comes from the oyer that is enclosed in the level of Malchus.
By itself, it cannot mehave.
So here's how, let me explain. What he's added now is, obviously makes the interface a lot deeper. If you look in the Geras HaKedesh that he referred to, he says the following words. He says, only atzmus, that mitziyuse ma'atzmuse, she'ein lo ilu v'siba acheres chaz v'shalom shekod melei, chaz v'shalom, only atzmus that has no cause and no his mitziyuse ma'atzmuse, his existence is from within, hu levade, he's the only one that can create yesh ma'ayin. Because oyer does not necessarily need mitzvah matzmuse. The sun gives off light, because light is not different than its source. So all you need is a source that relates to the light, and that's that. To create a yesh, existence of a yesh that we relate to, that's completely senses itself as a separate entity, only atzmus. But then he goes on to say, if you look in the Geras HaKedesh, it's, I think, vital for this, because he's really explaining the Geras HaKedesh. What does he say next? And how does that isavas happen? He says it's al yidei ha'oyer, shehu me'ein ha'moyer. Since the oyer is me'ein ha'moyer, so the oyer is the instrument, so to speak, that channels the divine creation. The creation can only come from atzmos, can't come from oyer. But oyer is God's way of creating. He creates through the oyer. So clearly the isavas is coming from the oyer, the highest levels of oyer. But the poil, that oyer will then go through stages. The highest levels will remain ayin of the yesh hamiti. The lower will become the ayin of the yesh hanivra, especially after the tzimtzum. And an ayin, if we remember, we learned that relates already to existence, whether before the tzimtzum or mamala, seva mamala, or in mamala itself. And that oyer will be mislabish and malchus, and actually give shape and form to each creation, hirakia, desha, and so on. So you need both. Well, if you remember, we learned on top, the koyach hamahav is havaya, shem havaya, shem etzem. But it goes through Shem Shemog and Hashem Elakim. So if you want an example, This example is really from Shari Yechad V'Amunah, where he says the following. Well, let me give the mashal. A projector of light. So the source of light is the projector. In this case, like the Yesh Amiti. The light carries the divine energy, but you'll see on the screen, it's white light. You don't have a specific creation. It's just light coming from the source. Comes a Shemesh Mogen, the Mogen, Elokim, Malchus, ultimately Malchus. In the higher levels, it's not Malchus, but in lower levels, it's Malchus. And Malchus is like you put a film between the light and the screen, and now you see Aleph, Beis, Gimel. Or Yihi Oyer, Aleph, Vavrei, Rekia, which will give existence its substance and its, I shouldn't say substance, its shape and form, the specific elements of creation. So if you're talking about the artist, the way it's all within himself, it's all one big vision. And that's where the power comes in. Without that, you have no creation altogether. But Isavas Bepeil is the Eris Slapshut Rebchinas Malchus. So what do you have here? That there are two, it's all originating from the source, from Eir HaDavuk. That's the carrier. But the carrier then will take the Eir and package it, so to speak, and each Eir will fit into the particular Maimer and Keli that it needs to fit into, the Asius and the Kalim. And the Eir too now is a defined Eir according to creation. So then regarding Dveikus, then it goes like this. It's a little more complicated now. He's adding another point. So the original power of creation comes from Eir Davuk, complete Dveikus. That's the carrier of the power of creation. Then comes a level of Eir, which we're going to be calling the Ayin of the Yesh Nivra, where there the Eir is only reason it has Dveikus is to be renewed from that place. But its main purpose is creating, and therefore we call that nivdal, relatively speaking. So basically the Dveikus now has two levels. One is due to renewable energy, to perpetually renew creation. And the second, because it's always connected to the Eir HaDavuk, the highest level of Eir that carries the power of creation. That's what he's adding here, to just fill in the whole picture. Malchus is a Ha'ara of a Ha'ara, yeah. Yeah. And the beauty, the eloquence of this is very clear, because had God created two tracks that started from Atzmos, one is the Koyach HaEir, and the Ayin of the Yesh Amiti, and a second track is the Eir that creates, and they don't speak to each other. Just hypothetically, what you would have is you'd have a disconnect. You would ultimately not have a total interface. You'd have the Ayin of the Yesh Amiti speaks the language of Elikus. The Ayin of the Yesh Nivra is Elikus as it speaks the language of existence. Where do they meet? So here is very clear. It all goes in one order. Yesh Amiti, Ayin of Yesh Amiti, Ayin of Yesh Nivra, and Yesh Nivra. The difference is that the Ayin of the Yesh Nivra is an Oyer that is, relatively speaking, Nivdal from the other Oyer, even though there's obviously a relationship between them. So that's what he now rounds out the whole subject. So his Chassidus is necessary for renewal purposes, and his Dveikus is necessary to connect it to the source. Okay.
And I just want to know, Malchus itself is like a modulator, like it's like a if you have a mold or something, it just shapes and forms things. That it doesn't. It's not like an active principle. It just breaks down and this and that. I mean,
I would not say that. Not in this context here. Malchus is like Koyach HaDibur of the Eibishter. It's God's way of speaking. So Malchus here is serving like the speaker that communicates God's intentions to create existence. So I would not call it, he said clearly it's a koyach, it's not just an outside force. It's connected to Elikus. He said it's Dovuk. However, its Dveikus is more for what I just said, either for renewal, to renew the energy. Malchus is basically the actual communicator of creation. That's how it is. In that sense, yes, it does break it down. In Dibur, you hear Rakia, you hear you hear Rakia. But it's still, Malchus is a sphere of Atzilus. So it's one of the koiches of Atzilus. Except it's a different type of koich. It's Nivdal in this sense. That's how I would put it. In the example with the film, yes, correct. A film is an outside force. But in Shayachud V'Amuni, he makes it clear the Mogin is also a godly energy. Elokim is also a name of God. It's just the name of Pa'ula. It's a Pa'ula of God. It's God's creative power, as opposed to Havaya, which is God's expressing God's core. I'm continuing line 4 from the bottom. Like it says elsewhere, Dibra Maskel Vayetzavim. Vayetzavim is a mimer from Va'era, Tofresh Lamed Ches. The Rebbe Marash said a very big, famous mimer, Vayetzavim, which is based on Vayetzavim from the Tzemach Tzedek and Eira Teira. We actually did a lot. We learned a lot from Vayetzavim back in volume 1, where was the discussion about Sfira Meloshin Sipur, the different meanings of Sfira. So Vayetzavim was a very important source back then, if I recall correctly. Yeah. Anyway, it's not relevant to our discussion here, but it's what he says. The ha'ara, what does he say in that maimer? The ha'ara hanimsheches me'ite yizborech lahaviz biyah. The reflection that transmits or is drawn me'ite yizborech from God to create biyah, b'riya yitzir asiyah, hu gam kem b'bchinas misper. Yeah, exactly. He talks about misper. It's also in a state of a number, which means a numbered structure. So clearly, it's a chiddush in that maimer Vayetzavim. So what do you see from this? That the ha'ara, even though it's a ha'ara alakis, and it's a ha'ara is bringing proof to what he just said. It's a divine energy to create. That divine energy comes from the highest energy of the oil, like he says, Eira Dovuk. And yet, when it comes to create biyah, it also assumes a number. Number is always structure. You can't say misped on Eir HaDavuk. On the Ayin of the Yesh Amiti, you never say the word number, because there are no numbers there. It's all focused on divine expression. Number right away tells you structure. That's what a number is. 1, 2, 3. So he's saying here that in Vayetzavim, he says that this ha'ara that comes from God to create biyah is in the state of a misper. So that's, I see it as it's just bringing proof to what he just said, that the ha'ara does not remain just pure divine. It relates to existence, and that's why you can call it what he said before, a ha'ara nivdelis. Umavur b'mokem acher, and it's explained elsewhere. I'll just read another line just to finish the subject. Shazeu ha'ara nimsheches ma'yichud de'ihu v'garmuhi. I think we should stop here. I'll just, since I read it already, translate it. That this ha'ara,
the mispo is Ihu
v'garmuhi. Is nimshach from the yichud of Ihu v'garmuhi. Garmuhi are the kalim. It's the yichud of the kalim, not the yichud of the eris. So he's going to explain now the difference between the yichud of the oir, which is essentially the oir hadavuk, and the yichud of dibur or kalim of Malchus that are involved in the creation process. But I see he's going into the thing here, so I think we should just stop here, because he's going to go to the next page, continue explaining this whole idea. Now bear in mind, yeah, okay. So we'll stop here, the bottom of page 1150.